Welcome to Import Stories and also to the series called Nostalgic Tangasseri. By now we have heard quite many stories about Tangi. As our new guest says, Tangi now exists only in the minds of people. It is a state of mind. In this episode, we have Mr. Ranjit Devraj, a Delhi-based journalist and an alumnus of Infant Jesus High School who passed out in 1971. That's almost 50 years ago. Ranjit has worked with the UNI News Agency and various other major media outlets too. Here, in this beautiful account, he describes life in Tangasseri and its relationship with Kollam district and the world beyond in the late 1960s and early 70s. He also traces the history of how Tangasseri developed as a result of pepper and spice trade and the wars that were fought to control it by the foreign powers. Indian independence inevitably led to the decline of Tangasseri and to the exodus of the anglo-Indian community. Though it could have been otherwise, this is how Ranjit argues. Let's listen to what Ranjit shares today from the nostalgia pocket of his memories. I welcome all of you to this episode.
Hello, I came to Tangasseri in the late 1960s when my family relocated to Kerala from Singapore. That was a time when Malayali families like mine settled in Singapore were opting to shift back to Kerala because the British had then decided to quit the island colony and there was a lot of uncertainty about the future. Now, this uprooting was a traumatic experience. I found myself transplanted from a well-organized, westernized society into chaotic, resource-poor Kerala and to Kollam or Koilon, the colonial name for the district that was home to my ancestors. I sorely miss my Chinese, Malay, British and Eurasian friends. Most of all, I missed being in a fluent, a multiracial, English-speaking Singapore. However, Kuala had a redeeming feature, Tangasseri, Tangi for short. At the northern end of the wide Koilon Bay, Koilon is a bay on the west coast of Kerala, was this quaint European enclave that time had forgotten. A relic of the many colonial era struggles and wars that followed Vasco da Gama's arrival on the Kerala coast in 1497. So, here was an English-speaking westernized oasis of Eurasians, or anglo-Indians as they are officially called in India. Here were people who listened to the kind of music I was familiar with and dressed in what seemed like normal clothes to my sensibilities anyway. Tangi contrasted starkly with the rest of Koilon, the dividing point being the famous Tangasseri Arch. Maybe I should explain a bit more. In the late 1960s, it was unusual to see men in Kerala wearing anything else but mundus, those wide loincloths. Even when going to office, many thought nothing of walking about bare-chested or walking on the streets barefoot. The policemen wore what looked like divided skirts and tall, conical, comical hats and leggings with no boots. They couldn't be serious, I told myself. In contrast, Tangi was civilization. People were well dressed. Everything seemed neatly ordered and pakka, starting with the streets that were laid out in a grid of fine bungalows and villas set in lush gardens, as if on a picture postcard. We don't use them nowadays. Emails and attachments. Many of the homes had large halls furnished with pianos, waiting for people to play them and dance to music. And there were people who could play these pianos very well. Our English teacher, Shiro Dakota, was one of them. She used to say, I am a jack of all arts, but master of one, the piano. Am I bragging? She would ask. And she would say, too bad. That is Sheila. Yes, music was big at Tag, and dancing too. There were music bands that played great music, and pretty girls smartly turned out in fine dresses. For me, best of all, this is where I was to continue my schooling after Singapore. That meant daily relief from the oppressive, hardcore mallowness of Kollam. I never ceased to marvel at this outpost of Western culture, Tangi, this fragile enclave that constantly looked westwards in more than one way across the Arabian Sea. Here were people who spoke English and had the values that came with the language. Now that's important. Of course, there were fine, sophisticated, accomplished people in the rest of Kollam. Make no mistake. Doctors, engineers, businessmen. But it wasn't the same. Couldn't be if they were wearing mundus. At least that was what I thought then. My personal impressions. Now, at both the schools, the Infant Jesus Anglo-Indian Boys High School and the Mount Carmel Convent School for Girls, it was de rigueur to be well shod, stiffly starched uniforms and school ties. Of course, shoes and ties were miserable in the humid coastal weather and in the wetness of a Kerala monsoon. Did I pronounce de rigueur properly? If I did, it's because Tangi had accomplished teachers. Teachers like Zita Fernandez, who were sticklers for good pronunciation, good deportment. She presided over all cultural activities at Infant Jesus. A blithe spirit that defied any sign of mallowness with rare charm and demeanor. A perfectionist, but practical too. She was adept at making do with what was available. Perhaps that defined the Tangi of those days. Making do and keeping up appearances. Many of the Anglo-Indian teachers had begun shifting to other cities of India already then. Bangalore, Chennai and Calcutta, where there was a demand for English medium education from the new post-independence elite that succeeded the British Raj. Some of this has been captured in the film 36 Chowringhee Lane, if you've seen it, through the character Violet Stoneham, who finally decides to emigrate to Australia after a lifetime of teaching Shakespeare in a Calcutta school. Her skills were no longer appreciated. That's what the movie said. Now, the 60s and the 70s were a time of hardship. India was then recovering from two costly wars, China in 1962 and 2 years later the war with Pakistan. In 1971, India fought yet another war with Pakistan, the one that created Bangladesh. So, Konon and Tangi were not immune to the economic effects of those wars. Tangibly, that meant stinky rationed rice and weed fit for cattle. None of that deterred Zita Fernandez. She could organize memorable, candlelit, lead kindly light ceremonies for final year students going out into the big wide world. And with equal elan, she could badger the Kuala municipality to surface the dirt roads of Tangi. These roads were terrible. They were alternatively dusty or muddy, depending on the season. These roads were never designed for the kind of traffic generated by the chauffeured cars in which the kids of Kuala gentry would be driven in to these two schools. Not just local manufactured ambassadors and Fiats, they were costly enough in those days, but many rode in on imported luxury models that looked like battleships. Bukes, Impalas, Plymouths, Dodges, Studebakers. The municipality responded. Initially, they dumped a lot of metal on the roads. Everyone had to put up with that. The metal somewhat settled the dust and the mud puddles created by the incessant rains of Kerala during the long monsoons. But the metal made the roads impossible to negotiate, especially for the pretty ladies of Tangi on their fashionable high heels. Perhaps, looking back, high heels tripping on poorly paved roads was a metaphor for the incongruity of the whole thing. Imagine fine high ceiling bungalows set amid well tended gardens, but opening out onto dirt roads. The theme might have been, "Don't bury me in this prairie where the cactus hurts my toes." Little wonder then that the Anglo-Indians saw it as a losing battle against the tide. You could hardly blame them for abandoning ship, move to better climes, and heritage be damned. The two schools flourished, however, mainly because they were patronized by the well-heeled cashew kings of Kollam, the same people who owned all those battleship kind of cars. There were also affluent families from the central Travancore belt to the north of Kollam district. Many were earning petrodollars in Kuwait and Bahrain, or owned rubber plantations, which were doing very well in those days. Wars had that effect on rubber, the prices go up. Now, these early Gulfies and rubber rajas saw in Tangi the ideal place to ensure that their wards acquired the highly priced English medium education, the passport to anywhere in the world. They understood the value. Of course, they had other options besides Tangi. Fine English medium schools, legacies of the British Raj existed in the neighboring hill stations of Tamil Nadu, Ooty, Kodi, Ketti, Yercaud, and so on. But nothing quite matched the ambience of Tangi. You could imagine this idyllic place, the gentle crash of waves in the distance, the salt air, the period villas, and best of all, the friendly, hospitable Anglo-Indian residents. The life of the Anglo-Indians was closely intertwined with the two schools. either as students or as teachers, or even through the running of private boardings. See, many of the residents had converted their homes into boardings for students from distant places. Perhaps it wasn't intentional, but the schools became the interface between the Anglo-Indians and the world outside. You could say people, the connecting link between people on both sides of the Tangi Arch. For us, whether we were boarders or day scholars, or even for the local young people, there were beautiful beaches where you could go for a dip, even a skinny dip for the boulder among us. We could wave out to the girls peeping out of the windows of the Mount Carmel convent. The bolder ones, the girls, would wave back at us and make our day. The convent was just yards from the beach. I mean, the girls were lucky. They could look out of their classroom windows out onto the wide Arabian Sea. Needless to say, this activity, all this wavings and everything was reported and banned. The swimmers had to betake themselves to less exciting areas of the Tangi beach. And in any case, the girls were forbidden from going anywhere near the windows after that. There were more innocent forms of entertainment for hot-blooded teenagers. We could explore the ruins of the 5th-century-old Portuguese-built St. Thomas Fort that once dominated the Coilon Bay, all the way to Purikara in Paru, at the southern end of that curve that was the bay. There was this lighthouse built by the British in 1902 with its powerful beam that stabbed out some 45 kilometers into the sea. If you stood at Purikara beach in Paru, the beam would hit you directly and you could actually feel the heat miles away. The lighthouse isn't much used to shipping nowadays, thanks to GPS and other modern, reliable navigational aids. Those days, the lighthouse keeper would allow us to clamber up the spiral stairway that led to the top of this 135-foot tower, at the top of which was this glassed-in chamber in which the powerful arc lamps were kept. So, of course, they would be switched on only at night. Now, from up there, on a clear day, if you looked eastwards, you could catch a glimpse of the high mountains, the high Western Ghats that forms a backdrop to Koilon, and indeed to all of Kerala. It's not apparent when you are down there in Koilon town, but the hills at the back, they are spectacular. The lighthouse is today the official symbol of Kollam. It now has an elevator installed for tourists and is fairly well maintained. Sadly, the same cannot be said for the St. Thomas Fort or the nearby graveyards of the fallen Dutch and the Portuguese. These have suffered, especially the fort, more damage from encroachments than from Dutch cannonballs. There have been attempts to shore up the crumbling sandstone masonry of the fort with bricks, but it's an amateur job. It couldn't have been looking the way it now looks. There have been attempts to, the archaeological survey has shown some interest, but we don't know how successful they are going to be, given that people have built their homes almost on top of the fort. Some time ago, a TV channel reported that the ancient tombstones over the graves of fallen Dutch and Portuguese soldiers next to the fort were being used by the local fisher folk to wash their laundry. Now, I would hasten to say that Kollam, for all its maloonas, was no stranger to the West or the Christian religion. It was frequented by Italian missionaries and others for upwards of 800 years, perhaps more. There were Syrian Christian pepper traders, Arabs, Chinese merchants. It is a port town, a well-known port town, Kollam. And Kollam was already a Catholic diocese in 1329. The oldest Catholic diocese in all of the East, not just India, mind you. That was almost 200 years before the Portuguese acquired Tangi and turned it into a flourishing, fortified trading enclave. But the success of the Portuguese was what proved to be their downfall as the masters of Tangi. Other European rivals for the lucrative spice trade for which Kerala was known landed on the scene. The Dutch, followed by the English. So Tangasseri became the center of those land and sea battles along the Kerala coast that involved the Portuguese, the Dutch, the Arabs, and the local rulers who were, interested in the spice trade, but were quite powerful in their own right. I mean, they could defeat the Dutch in naval battle. They kept the Portuguese at bay. So there must have been a lot of bloodshed. We know about massacres, Europeans being massacred in Anjano and so on. The ruined fort is now a tourist site, and the graveyard. I mean, these must have been testimony to really violent times. One of the homes in Tangi actually has a large stone cannonball lying in the compound. It's so heavy you can't pick it up. It must have been fired from one of the ships, Dutch ships. All this ended after Pax Britannica descended on Tangi. The British had taken over. Now, through all those times of turmoil and turbulence, the inhabitants of Tangasseri stayed staunchly Catholic. Tangi continues to be the seat of the bishop of the Roman Catholic Diocese of Kollam, or Kollam. The bishop's palace is housed in a fine heritage building with a large chapel attached to it. The main building of the Infant Jesus School is similarly ancient. No less a figure than St. Francis Xavier established the San Salvador Seminary and the adjacent Infant Jesus Cathedral, which was equipped with one of the oldest printing presses in India, possibly the oldest. Some of its publications are still available for those interested in history. In the Harvard University, the cathedral or pro-cathedral was integral to the Infant Jesus School in our times. It is popular with us regardless of our own religious backgrounds. It's particularly well frequented at exam time, as may be imagined. It is also popular with the girls from Mount Carmel Convent, a matter of considerable delight to us boys, as may also be imagined. The church saw its share of love and war, apart from piety and devotion. The graveyard behind the church was where all schoolboy disputes were settled by tournament. The supporters of the disputing parties would gather around in a circle and encourage the combatants with shouts of fight, 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 and also intervene or call for disengagement if it looked like real damage was about to be inflicted to a combatant. I mean, these were spirited fights, like real wars. And very often they ended up in a free-for-all, between the supporters of the warring parties. Though matters had to be kept under the lid, to avoid undue attention from the authorities. A caning could result. They never spared the rod in Tangi. Now, there was, I should say, in all honesty, there was this us and them aspect to it all, between the Anglo-Indians and the rest. Maybe such feelings were inevitable for historical reasons. In the 1930s, when princely Travancore tried to seize the enclave, representations were made to the governor in Madras. The matter went before British Parliament, and the British stood by the colony. That is how the Tangasseri arch was erected, to mark the boundaries of the territory. So Tangi more or less had its own representative, an adhikari. You can still see his offices. They've become, the storehouse for medicines or something, or the post office lately, I'm told. The arch, though, more or less kept the mundus outside the arch, and the pretty dresses and western outfits inside, until independence in 1947 and the formation of the Indian Union. You have to think that there were also churches outside the arch, several of them, because there was a Catholic population around there. So that's what I meant by when I said that the entire area had a Catholic sense. There are older churches in Badi, for example, nearby, along the coast from Tangi. Well, all said and done, the friendships were thick. The Bahamis survived, even thrived, as you can see, over Facebook and WhatsApp. Social media groups include not only our old classmates or schoolmates, but also our teachers. Keith Dickrus, our well-loved physics teacher, who went on to become the principal of a school in Chennai, and Lloyd Fernando, now settled in Canada. Even the nonagenarian young lady, Kathleen de Rosario, continues to guide and moderate us through Yahoo groups, because the fights continue. It's just that there's no graveyard. The fights now continue in cyberspace. That's the only difference. Could Tangi have survived the way it was? In retrospect, that's doubtful. By the 70s, it was clear that the Indian economy wasn't going anywhere. Not that it's going anywhere now. Countries like Australia were beckoning the Anglo-Indians as people likely to assimilate into its own society. So, the gain of Melbourne and Mississauga in Canada was to be Quilon's loss. The schools continued to grow, blowed actually, because standards deteriorated. The new accents and attitudes would not have amused Zita Fernandez or Sheila Decoto. Even that much beloved old church next to the school, with its simple classic lines, was torn down. Apparently, when no one was watching, there was a struggle to preserve it by people who are heritage minded. In its place, there now stands a ghastly building that belongs in Star Wars, not in an old Portuguese enclave where the likes of Alfonso de Albuquerque and Francis Xavier once roamed. Half a century after I left school in 1971, Tangi has become unrecognizable. So much has changed. But then Cologne itself has changed. People are now following the anglo-indians to look to Western countries and other destinations. Now that's the irony of it. Everybody's abandoning ship, looking for opportunities abroad. The policemen wear proper trousers and are well shod, and actually behave rather well compared to the rest of India. Economic liberalization has put more money in people's hands. And the overall outlook is far less insular. Maybe it's the influence of Abu Dhabi and Dubai, this Gulf boom that happened after the 70s and 80s. A whole generation of Mallus have now grown up in these places, born there. Maybe they think like me now when they come to Kerala, but it's a lot better than in the 60s and 70s. These are times when foreigners come to Kerala scouting around for homestays. They like to live in exotic locales with a history. Tangi would have been the ideal place for them. You find foreigners even buying up small properties in places like Goa to spend their winters in. No heating bills, the food is good and cheap, friendly people, not much crime. Yes, there are people trying to, build up Tangi as a homestay destination. Fine restaurants, hotels have come up. Some of the old villas have been restored to their pristine glory by the new owners. Frankdale, I saw this beautiful property the last time I was there. Bit like locking the stables after the horses have fled. The Anglo-Indians have gone. And the place is bereft of what gave it that essential, its essence. Tangi now exists only in the minds of people who lived there or went to school there. People like me. Tangi is now a state of the mind, you might say. Maybe that's the whole idea of the present series by Lakshmi Tambe. Transferring that Tangi that exists in our minds into an electronic form for posterity. It's a record. The genes have fled, but maybe the memes will survive thanks to her. Thank you.